get these two screws in place. Tighten them up. Now as I swing the focus lever, you'll see that the connector at the top swings backwards and forwards. That couples to the rangefinder. So that's all good. I'll just apply a little bit of synthetic grease to the track at the top here that runs in. As the front of the camera is collapsed, that tracks down that slot, and then the slot runs off in this direction so that the arm will fold back into the body. So it's folded back over here, and as it comes out it pulls forward so that your rangefinder adjustment is all done with that stud moving in that straight line, which simplifies the arrangement of the coupling for the rangefinder at the top no end. So there we have that part. Now the transfer shaft at the front here, I'll get the pieces for that. In this case we have two pieces. Some cameras have three pieces to do this job. Some have a guide that fits on top here. This is guided in the casting itself, so I put a little bit of synthetic grease in there. That couples to our transfer shaft in the back of the camera, and that should have picked up now. I'm just checking that it did. Yes, there's no problem there. And here's the shroud that goes around that piece. And that's held in place with two chromed screws. These screws are easily scarred, so it's not uncommon to find them one uglier than the other. If you've got one ugly screw, put it in this position. In this position it can't be seen. Keep the best screw for the top position where it can be seen. Pick up the second one, get that in position. Now, before I tighten these screws up, normally I put a bit of outward pressure on this bush. That makes sure that it's not in contact with the focus scale ring. Otherwise you can end up with that scraping and causing you a nuisance. And also you do not need this in firm contact with the curved rack. A bit of backlash in the gear there is probably beneficial. So do not push it inwards before you do the screws up. You'll only cause yourself grief. Right, so that's the front part done really. And now with everything in place, you see as I press in the buttons at top and bottom, I can fold the front up, no problem at all. So that's good. And I can turn my attention to doing the film advanced components next. So I'll start with the lock lever and the release lever, which are these pieces. Come on camera, hurry up and focus. I'm having a bad day, isn't I? Move that out of the picture. That's a bit better. Right, so I need to lubricate the body where this shaft runs, which is here and here, here and here, here and here. The stub goes in here, and along this front lip here, this return spring on that release lever runs. And I just have to lubricate that with a touch of molybdenum paste too. And you're never doing much more than leaving a dirty mark when you're putting molybdenum paste on. You don't apply it in great gobs. Now that lever appears to feels a bit stiff. Why is that? I suspect it's bent. It's bent at the top end of this lever here is bent. I don't know. That's interesting. Now how would that have happened? And would it have any bearing on that damaged cocking rack? Possibly. I'll straighten this up. And a bit more. If I straighten it up too much and snap it, of course, I'm going to be busy finding a replacement. Yeah, it is quite bent. Let's try that. Yeah, that's good. That feels very good. Okay, so that part's good. I can fit its spring. I'll back you out a bit. Hard to get you in there. That's better. This return spring and the clip. So the return spring, I hold that down with one hand. And take the circlip, pop that in place. That's good, just checking that that lever pops in and out easily under spring tension. That's good. That's that lever locks the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. Right, so the release lever. The release lever needs its spring on the end. And I have to check the spring to make sure that it's not distorted. It looks pretty good. And now I have to get that in place on the lever. The design of this spring changed a bit over time with the retinas. Generally to be simplified in form. That's good. That slides up into the body. Got to guide it up into the body at the top. Make sure that return spring doesn't get trapped or bent over. And we have a return spring at the top. And the screw that holds it all together. Here. The top of the shaft is split so that it holds that screw fairly firmly. Sometimes it doesn't hold it firmly enough and the screw loses its adjustment. That one feels quite good. Sometimes if it's squeezed in too tight, it's very difficult to get the screw started. Now I need to think about the take-up spool and the advance shaft. The advance shaft, I'm checking that the cam on the bottom is not loose. Oh, that's good. So I've got to lubricate that and get these in place. This is just a plain metal bush that goes into the bottom of the take-up spool, and I can pop that into the body, straight into the cavity there, the metal bush to the bottom of the camera. And I need to lubricate this. Normally I use some graphite grease, which I have right here. Graphite grease can do a great job. It's very messy. This is not the most outstanding graphite grease I've ever had, but it does the job well enough. So I'll run some up the top of that bush, make sure it's worked in well, that everything rotates smoothly. Run some onto the spring so that the spring works smoothly, otherwise the coils of the spring tend to bind on itself, particularly as it's tensioned up. If somebody has set with too much return tension, that spring can bind up and cause you problems. So don't overdo the return tension for the film advance. Sometimes people will increase the amount of tension on a spring like that in order to make the film advanced lever return to the park position smoothly, when really what they need to do is remove everything, clean everything, and make sure that everything is moving smoothly, not just rely on winding the tension of the springs up in a hope that that will make things move correctly. Usually it won't. Right, so let's see if I can get this shaft in correctly. That felt like it popped into place. That's good. Now line up the fixture plate. And there are 3 screws that hold this in position. And they should be the ones with no glue on them, because of course they've been hidden away down here getting covered in grease instead. It's 2. Also I've got a choice now, because after all the cleaning the adhesive and other filth has tended to go anyway. There should be 3 comparatively clean screws in these positions. Do those screws up. Don't overdo it, tightening them up. All you'll end up doing is distorting the screws, and they won't hold any tighter. They may even break. That part's done. At the top of the camera, I need to assemble and fit the clutch assembly. Clutch assembly consists of 3 pieces. And this I lubricate again with graphite grease. So I run some graphite grease around the inside of the outer clutch component. And then I want a pair of pliers to compress the spring while I get this all together. And the favoured tool is this one. To assemble this, there's a tab sticking upwards on this spring that couples with a slot in the centre component. So I hang it on like that in the slot, get my tool on the top and then rotate that to pull the spring into place. So the spring's all compressed. Slide the outer component into position and there we have it. The clutch is always much smoother in one direction than the other, and as it happens it's very lucky that the much smoother direction is the direction we need it to move. So I'll apply a bit of synthetic grease to the inside of that where it runs on the film advance shaft, rotate that into position, it should drop into the top of the take up spool like that, and here's the guide bush for the top of the film advance shaft. That has this gear on it, little pinion there. I'll force a bit of grease in there, a white in the centre, that should drop into position. If I rotate the take up spool backwards and forwards, that'll settle that. And that is held in place with two screws. One is the shoulder screw that sits on this side, and that shoulder at the top supports the shutter cocking rack. I'm stirring that up lightly. There's a bush that goes here. Now the bush has a slight countersink on one side and it's flat on the other. The flat side goes upwards, don't mix it up, otherwise you will do the screw up and it will just lock the ratchet in place. Little ratchet pull goes on there, and then there's the screw that holds it all in place. I'll just put a wipe of grease on the top of that so that the little ratchet moves smoothly. Don't put grease on the thread. If you put grease on the thread, it's possible that might assist the screw in winding loose at some later date. Okay, so that's in place. Let's just do those screws up lightly. There's a spring that goes on here, the return spring for that little ratchet pull. And so I want to get that in position over the top of that screw. There's a groove around the top of the screw where that fits. And this is always a bit entertaining to install. You've got to get it over that screw, tucked behind that lever so that the lever is lightly sprung loaded towards the centre. That's so that it engages with the gear here. And that's just to stop that thing from backing up at any time. It means it can only move in one direction. Taking this component, I'll put a little bit of grease on the underside of that and rotate that into position. You can see that rotates in one direction. You can see the ratchet move as it does. This little spring, leaf spring here, I have just put a very thin smear of grease on that, and that's because I don't want it to go rusty. Not really, because it needs to be lubricated. That goes there. That drive dog goes there, over the squared section on the film advance shaft. Check that that's seated correctly. That washer goes there. Now next up is the gear. The gear from the top of the film advance shaft. Now, we know the damaged teeth of the rack were running over that gear, so I've got to inspect this very closely and see if any of the teeth show any sign of damage, and if they do, make sure that we don't have that piece of the gear engaging with the rack. it looks pretty good. I'm just trying to gauge this, to gauge whether any of the teeth show any distortion or misshapenness. I think that's probably fine, and certainly it's fine in that orientation. So, the screw that holds that in place. Get it up tight, that's good. That's the film advance shaft in and correctly positioned. Okay, so before I start losing stuff, I'm going to put a rubber band on the top of that. Just stabbed myself with a pair of tweezers. Never mind. Put a rubber band across here to stop that shutter release shaft from falling out, because it will create a nuisance if it does. I'll put that where are we? I'll put the rewind shaft on first, I think. And I've got something to hook it to. So, the inner piece of the rewind, put a little bit of synthetic grease on that. Slide that into the outer section. It's got a tab on one side so it engages with the slot. That's it. Apply some synthetic grease to the bush. There's a couple of styles of bush in these cameras. This one has a little brass insert in there. Now I was concerned that this rewind had been pushed across, so I'm just looking closely to see if it shows any sign of that or whether it was all in my imagination. Yeah, it definitely has got a lean. Right, I'm going to set it on the body in that orientation. If I decide it needs to be adjusted violently or otherwise at a later date, I will do so. It's held in with 2 screws. I'll do those up tight. And I'll just pull that upwards and run a rubber band across to the shutter release shaft, so the shutter release is unlikely to just fall out and cause me a nuisance. So far so good. That's good. Now at the base of the camera we need our tripod socket and things back in place. And where is that? I've got the tripod socket, but I can't see the little insert that goes in here. Here it is. Three screws hold the tripod socket in place. Just run them down loosely. When they're all in place, then you can tighten them up. The third one. One, two, 3. Okay. The lever for the rewind button needs to go in. I'm just looking at the state of that spring. Is that seated correctly? Just pull that lever down and have a look. I don't like the look of that spring. So the spring on the lever here, I think that's damaged. It's not sitting at the right angle. I'm going to take that off. So that's that screw from the top. Sometimes, particularly with old cameras, springs just give up the ghost. You know, they're sitting there quite happily and they've been sitting there happily for decades, but when somebody comes along and actually pushes on them, they suddenly decide they'd rather be in 2 pieces. And that's exactly what this spring's done. It's got a kink in it. I think it's damaged. I don't know whether that's broken. I can tell that's so sharp. That's had it. I'm going to have to find another spring for that. Back sure. I'm a lot happier about that new spring. Got to see about this lock lever for the rewind button. So the lock lever is this little piece, and the nose of that I want to lubricate with a bit of molybdenum paste so that it moves smoothly. That's rotate as the film advance lever comes round, the post in here hits the end of that lever and swings it across. Here's its return spring. And the screw that holds it in place, that's a shoulder screw. It holds the spring in position, and the shoulder further down holds the lever in position. Now where's that sharp pair of tweezers that stabbed me a minute ago? Now they can earn their keep. I'll just use these to pull that spring across. That's good. So the film sprocket is here. It goes into the body. There's a slot on one end, the slot goes upwards. I'll lubricate the shaft lightly with a bit of synthetic grease at the bottom and at the top. And I'll just run a little bit onto the gear at the top, just a tiny bit, where it engages. Just drop that into position in the body, down through the sprocket, and at the bottom of the camera I'll pull back this lever and allow that to drop into position. So that's good. That's sitting in position. And there's a screw that holds the shaft and the sprocket here together. It's a little short screw, basically the same as the screws used for the hinges on the front door. So where is that hiding? Here we go. Screws down over there. The rewind button and its washer and its return spring we want next. So normally I put a little bit of grease on the return spring rewind button goes through the spring, through its washer, holding my finger on the top of that shaft at the top to keep it from pushing away. That screws into the bottom of the sprocket shaft, checking that the shaft runs through the washer smoothly. That worked well. The appropriate pair of pliers for doing it up is this one. Just do that up, nip that up, doesn't need much. And that's our rewind button in place. Our take up spool is in place. I think I can put the base plate on the camera. So to do that, first I want to tension up the film advance mechanism. So I'll swing this out of the position. Let's get this one clear. That's our lock lever. I'll push that out of the way. Hold the release lever backwards out of the position. Rotate this one full turn. That's our start position for the film advance now. Now I need the base plate.